In 2024, the U.S. recorded a record high goods trade deficit of $1.2 trillion, while China posted a record high goods trade surplus of nearly $1 trillion. It's $992 billion. And according to Chinese customs data, China's trade surplus with the U.S. was $361 billion. So you see, that's 36% of China's total trade surplus. So in other words, 30% of China's total trade surplus was with the United States. And so this data shows you why the American market is irreplaceable for China. However, these figures are based on official data and do not include goods China rerouted through Southeast Asia, South America, and other regions. China's real trade surplus with the US is much bigger. They're hidden in the trade surpluses with other countries. So in 2024, China's goods trade surplus with the EU was $247 billion, while the same year, the EU's good trade surplus with the US was about $214 billion. China's trade surplus with Asian countries was $191 billion, and the Asian countries have a trade surplus with the US at $227 billion. So you see, so for both the EU and the Asian countries, their surplus with the US offset their trade deficit with China. So in other words, the EU and Asians' trade deficits with China are ultimately offset by their trade surpluses with the United States. So in short, as the world's largest exporter, China's real dependence on the US is much deeper than the bilateral trade numbers that we've seen. So now let's talk about Southeast Asian countries. Southeast and South Asian countries have become key transshipment points for Chinese exports. So now let's talk about Vietnam. In 2024, its GDP was approximately $476 billion. That's under $500 billion. Surprisingly, Vietnam's exports to US accounted for 28.6% of its GDP at $136.6 billion, while US exports to Vietnam were only at about 13 billion. So that is, Vietnam's export to the US was almost 30% of the country's GDP, and its import from the US is only 1/10 of its exports to the US. This led to a massive $124 billion trade deficit with the United States. So if you compare this to China's trade surplus with the US, Vietnam's trade surplus is 42% that of China. But think about it, Vietnam's GDP is only 1/40th of China's GDP. So how could Vietnam have such a high trade surplus with the United States without having it contribute directly to its economy or GDP? In 2024, Vietnam exported about $61.2 billion worth of goods to China, down roughly $1 billion from 2023, while its imports from China grew 30%, surging to about $144 billion. So Vietnam's trade deficit with China widened from around $49.3 billion in 2023 to about $82.8 billion in 2024, a mind-boggling 68% increase year over year. So you see, Vietnam's imports from China is almost the same as its export to the US. So this explains to us that Vietnam didn't produce it. It was a reroute. Vietnam was a transit stop in U.S. China trade. It exported the goods it imported from China to the United States. And this is the reason why its massive export to the United States didn't contribute to its GDP. I want to show you some of the trade deficits with other Asian countries, but Vietnam definitely has the highest trade surplus with the United States. China's trade surplus in 2024 was up 21% from the previous year. A substantial portion of this surplus came from the Asian countries, which Vietnam is part of. Asian countries were China's largest export destination in 2024. This increase was purely rerouting business, with the final destination being the United States. In 2024, I show you European countries' trade surpluses with the US by country. Ireland leads all European countries in trade surplus with the US. This is probably because a lot of large American companies have subsidiaries in Ireland. And then the US has always had trade deficits with Germany, Italy, and France. At the same time, the EU also has trade deficits of approximately 330 billion with China. Now, the EU doesn't provide trade deficit or surplus data with China at a country level. It does not show the breakdown. So I was forced to look at the Chinese trade data. And then the CCP has yet to release the detailed trade data for Europe for 2024. So what I show you in the spreadsheet in the second column is the 2023 European country trade deficit or surplus with China. I know it's not an apple-to-apple comparison, but it's what I can gather at this point, and I think it's close enough just to illustrate my point. So what I want to point out is most European countries have long maintained a trade deficit with China, but has a trade surplus with the United States. This means that the US has effectively been helping the EU offset its trade deficit with China. The United States has provided the safe net to Europe in balancing its trade, ultimately benefiting the CCP. Now, the United States' two neighbors are the same. Mexico enjoyed a trade surplus about $172 billion with the US in 2024, while suffered a deficit of $71 billion with China. So between the US and China, Mexico had a net trade surplus of a whopping $100 billion. Similarly, for Canada, it exported approximately $413 billion worth of goods to the US and imported $349 billion from the US, resulting in a trade surplus of $63 billion. Meanwhile, Canada ran a trade deficit with China at about $31 billion. So it has a net surplus of $32 billion between U.S. China, the world's largest market and the largest producer. So for now, the U.S. has not imposed reciprocal tariffs on Canada or Mexico, although it had previously announced 25% tariffs related to their lack of actions on fentanyl and illegal immigration. So the United States has long had trade deficits, not just with China, but with most countries across the Americas, Europe, and Asia. The U.S. new tariffs aim to fundamentally reverse this imbalance, blocking not only direct dumping by the CCP, but also transshipment dumping through third countries. The U.S. also wants its neighbors and allies to recognize that the U.S. will no longer help them cover their trade deficits with the CCP. All countries must work to confront the CCP and collectively block its dumping practices. This should become one of the main points on the agenda in the upcoming negotiations between the United States and its neighbors and allies. I think this is one of the most important highlights of this tariff war. The entire tariff war, from my perspective, aims at shutting down CCP's export dominance or export dumping and supply chain control.